I was having a normal day. My day starts at 7 a.m. I start working on my computer because I work from home in Sevilla, in the south of Spain. And at 12:30, around that time, I realized there is no internet. So I restart the router, and the router is also not working. So I check with my roomie. She also didn't have internet.
It's April 28, 2025, and something strange is happening.
And then we check the light of the house, and the light was not working. So we go out into the corridor to check the light, and there was also no light.
The power's gone out. Irena is not sure why, though. So she does that thing that many southern Spaniards do when something's up. It's a kind of balcony groupthink.
That moment we went out to the balcony because there is a lot of communication with the neighbors from balcony to balcony. It's a very narrow street. And there is like old people living across, so we always check how they are and how they feel. And one of the grandmas was already in the balcony, and she was asking like, "Vecina, ¿qué pasa? Estoy sin luz." And like saying, "Neighbor, what's going on? I'm without light."
Turns out, it's not just Irena's building that's lost power. News starts coming in from all directions that our neighbours are without light. And some of them have some interesting theories as to why.
There is a bar below my place that it's always full with neighbors, and even if it was 12:30, they were already there drinking some beers and some coffees, and so they were chatting and laughing and saying like, "Estos son los rusos que han atacado Europa," like saying the Russians attacked Europe, and others were just like, "Okay, the most important is that we still have cold beer, no? Aquí la cervecita por lo menos que no nos la toquen." Like, don't touch our cold beer.
As it turns out, it wasn't Russia attacking Europe and cutting off the cold beer supply. It was a massive countrywide blackout across Spain, Portugal, and parts of southern France. All of a sudden, like the flick of a switch, 60 million people lost power. It was the most severe blackout Europe has seen in the last 2 decades.
You know, you don't have food, you don't have water, you don't have air conditioning or heating.
Trains came to a halt, elevators froze, traffic lights went out, homes lost everything from fridges to personal oxygen machines. Hospitals had to cancel non-urgent procedures and fire up the generators to continue urgent care.
So we started realizing how many things are dependent on energy that we are not aware in the daily life. My main concern was like, okay, I need to reach out to my family and see if they are all safe. Luckily, there were some moments of connection, of phone connection. So I reached my mom. She works at a school. The parents and everyone were a bit in a crisis, of course, but everyone was safe.
The only information we received came from people arriving from outside, telling us the city was in chaos.
For more than 10 hours, the Iberian Peninsula sat in the dark. What on earth caused a power failure on this scale?
In my case, maybe because I'm a journalist as well, the first thing I thought is like, don't let yourself go with rumors, because we know how misinformation, how harmful that is and how dangerous.
Irena was right. It was too early to tell. But it didn't take long for rumours to start spreading and the blame game to begin. A Russian cyber attack, terrorism, a solar storm, an atmospheric vibration. Too much wind and solar, too much nuclear, not enough nuclear. But what if I told you it was none of those single things that ultimately broke the grid, but something much bigger and much messier? Hey, I'm Charlie Shield, co-host of Living Planet. And I don't know about you, but right now I'm really not sure what to think about the future. One minute, we hear this.
The planet experienced its hottest year ever in 2024.
The Trump administration is moving to open up a large chunk of Alaskan wilderness to oil.
China now says it has increased its daily coal production by over 1 million tons.
And it feels, well, like we're cooked. But then we hear stuff like this.
Clean energy from the sun, solar energy, has become the cheapest way to generate electricity.
If the boom in clean energy continues, China's emissions will start falling.
Renewable energy has overtaken coal as the world's leading source of
And
electricity.
it seems like
for the first
maybe,
time.
just maybe, we could be turning a corner. But fossil fuels still dominate, and the energy transition is proving anything but simple. In this new 3-part miniseries from Living Planet, we're going from the deserts of Morocco to the grids of Europe and then into legendary climate writer Bill McKibben's office to ask why this is all so hard.
For the first time, we have a tool that can take a bite out of how hot the planet eventually gets.
This is episode 2. Last week, in part 1 of this special miniseries, we were in Morocco, hearing about the promise and the politics of renewable energy in a place with lots of sun and not much capital. If you haven't heard that one yet, it's okay. It still makes sense to start with this episode, but I do recommend going back and giving it a listen when you're done with this one. This week, in part 2 of The Switch, we're exploring the other side of the energy coin, transmission. How the way we move electricity, not just make it, is holding things up. And the Iberian blackout is a good place to begin, because the day's chaos has highlighted some of the biggest cracks threatening grids across Europe and slowing down cleaner, cheaper power flow. So what actually happened that day?
This is a very peculiar case in the history of blackouts in the world, let's say.
This is Marcial Gonzalez. He's an electrical engineer based at the University of Carlos III in Madrid.
Because one of the main problems came from the voltage control. And this is something very unique and very unusual.
In the wake of the blackout, Marcial's phone started blowing up with journalists wanting to know what went wrong. So he tells me he's pretty used to explaining this.
We already know exactly what happened. Then we have to ask why that happened. That will come afterwards. But at least today we know exactly what happened. And it's these voltage problems.
Voltage problems. According to the factual report released by the European Grid Operators Expert Panel, several things happened to trigger these voltage problems. One of which was sudden changes in power flow.
All the morning there was some instabilities in the electrical grid produced by the interconnections with countries in Europe.
Why these happened, they still don't know. But to calm them, the Spanish grid operator adjusted a few things, including dialing down electricity exports to France. That did help manage the flow. But it also caused a spike in voltage.
It was a problem that was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until suddenly generators started to disconnect.
For an electrical grid to function, voltage needs to stay within tight limits. Not too much, not too little. In this case, when it surged on February 28, 2025, energy transformers and power plants automatically shut themselves off.
And suddenly the generators were failing and all the system was collapsing.
Most blackouts are caused by frequency problems, not voltage, Marcial says. The Iberian blackout was the first ever voltage-driven power collapse of this scale in Europe's history.
And because the nature of this event was very unique, the system was not really prepared for reacting to this collapse, and finally that led to the full blackout. That happened in a really small time frame. So we are talking about seconds or even milliseconds.
Europe experiencing a historic cross-border power outage on Monday, and the region's leaders are doing everything possible to not blame renewable energy. Millions.
Look, as soon as this happened, everybody who follows energy closely and understands how electrical grids work knew that it was renewables.
But one of the real problems is the involvement of renewable energy sources, wind and solar. So Europe has been pursuing a very foolish net zero policy.
These were some of the headlines and sentiments amid a wave of misinformation doing the rounds on the internet in the wake of the Iberian blackout. And while a lot went wrong that day to cause the outage, when you look at the facts, there's nothing to suggest that it was caused by too much solar or wind, Marcial explains.
Many people were saying that one thing that may cause the blackout is that the system was operating with high penetration of renewable energy sources.
Spain runs on nearly 50% solar and wind electricity. That is some of the highest in the world. But the high amount of renewables did not cause the power outage. Firstly, Marcial points out, there'd been even more solar and wind generation in the days leading up to the blackout.
And nothing happened. So we cannot expect renewables to introduce such a big perturbations in the system.
Secondly, there were the claims that the blackout was caused by a lack of inertia from wind and solar. But this theory has also been disproven. Here's why. So inertia is basically what keeps something moving once it's been set in motion. Think of the spinning wheels of a bike, for example. Coal and gas plants use giant spinning turbines that store this momentum, whereas wind and solar don't provide much of it. And because the electrical grid needs electromagnets to spin at the same speed at all times, so 50 hertz in Europe, even small lapses in this speed can throw the whole system off. So the claim was that without enough inertia, because of the high penetration of wind and solar, the grid couldn't stabilise frequency issues. But, as we've already learned, this blackout was caused by voltage issues, not frequency issues. Spain's main grid operator, Red Electrica, confirmed in an official report that low inertia was not to blame for the power outage.
Today, we already know that this was very, very unfair and of course, totally inaccurate. A lot of people was blaming renewables because it was simpler. It was very easy to understand. It was very easy to develop this argument, and a lot of people was buying it.
A similar response was seen in Texas in February 2021, after a massive power outage led to the deaths of more than 200 people.
This shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America.
The power grid in the state became totally reliant on windmills. Then it got cold and the windmills broke, because that's what happens in the Green New Deal.
It just shows that fossil fuel is necessary for the state of Texas as well as other states to make sure that we'll be able to heat our homes in the wintertime and cool our homes in the summertime.
Critics were quick to pin the blame on wind power, but investigations later revealed that it was primarily caused by gas plants shutting down due to abnormally freezing temperatures. And since then, the new grid operator in Texas says that battery storage from solar and wind have actually helped protect the system from blackouts. Investigations into exactly why the voltage issues occurred and sparked the Iberian blackout are ongoing. The European grid operators expert panel is expected to release its final report on the causes in 2026. Meanwhile, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has said it's clear that it cannot ever be allowed to happen again. What experts have concluded so far is that Spain's grid needs to be more resilient and better managed. And the issues revealed don't just apply to Spain. They point to deeper, continent-wide cracks in the system, a system that's struggling to keep up. In fact, across Europe, more than 1,700 gigawatts worth of renewable and hybrid projects are stuck waiting for a grid connection. That is more than 3 times the capacity required to meet the EU's 2030 climate targets.
It's a whole messy situation.
Elizabeth Cremona is a senior energy analyst at EMBA, an independent energy think tank that does research on the renewable energy transition. She's on their Europe team and she's based in Malta.
If you want my very honest opinion, I think the cause is the fact that the grid has not been prepared or has not been invested in the way it needs to have been.
In other words, the blackout wasn't caused by too much change too fast, but quite the opposite. Years of neglect of some critical infrastructure that almost everything else depends on. But before we go any further, I thought it might be helpful to conjure a picture of the grid, if you don't have something in your mind's eye already. I asked Elizabeth if she had a good metaphor.
So you drive along a highway and then you get off and you go along your suburban road towards your house. And that's exactly the way the power system works as well. So you have super huge generators, so whether it's wind and solar, gas, nuclear, They are all along the highways, the transmission system. But then for that power to get to your house, it has to kind of turn off and go down into the smaller roads and get to your house. So that's the distribution system, the transmission system. And all countries across the world work in this way.
And now back to that lack of investment.
In Spain, there's an actual legislative cap on how much you can spend on the power grid, and it's 0.86% of your GDP every year.
Since the Iberian blackout, which is estimated to have wiped about 1.6 billion euros or $2 million off of Spain's GDP, the Spanish government has decided to somewhat increase this cap on grid spending. Over the past 5 years, Spain has only spent 30 US cents to upgrade its grid for every dollar it's put into renewables. And that is the lowest ratio of any European country.
And that's not the way it works for power grids, right? You need a strategy, you need to figure out the best way, the most cost-efficient way, but it can't just be capped at a random percentage of your GDP.
And that has left it without some critical gear that other countries use to avoid blackouts.
One of the things that really struck me outside of the factual report, 1.5 months after the blackout, they approved the grid operator to install what they call synchronous compensators on the grid in Spain. And these are basically units that provide dynamic voltage control on the grid, which was precisely the problem, it seems, of the blackout, the ultimate cause of the blackout.
If you're like me and you need some help here, a synchronous compensator is basically a giant spinning machine that helps to manage voltage. It stabilises grids by either generating power if there's too little or absorbing excess power if there's too much. And many energy experts believe that if Spain had enough of these machines, the Iberian blackout could have been avoided.
So the fact that after the blackout, they decided that for the very first time they need to install these synchronous compensators, there was clearly some kind of lack of consideration of how you operate a safe and secure power system, which is ultimately the remit of the transmission system operator.
And there are also other systems-level reasons that Europe has struggled to invest in its grids. One of them has to do with how most grids are governed. Elizabeth says that there is a lot of room for reform here. A good place to start would be separating who plans the grid from who operates it, something that they've recently done in the UK.
They've now got grid planning done by an independent system planner.
And that means that decisions about updating and modernising the grid are not tied to profit. When grid planning happens inside the same company that owns and operates the wires, it often incentivises them to stick to the system that they already make money from. And that is usually a lower demand fossil-fuelled system. Because they can often make more money by limiting competition from new energy providers. Good for shareholders, not for the public. The UK now has a fully independent public body in charge of planning its energy system, and a separate company for operating and maintaining the grid.
So they've made that change, which again, I think is really great. We're already seeing huge advancements in the way that they plan and look at the development of their grid. But I do think that that will sadly be a harder fight in European countries, simply because you have the problem of big incumbents who have a lot of leverage. So they own the entire grid, and it's probably within their interests to maintain control over how their infrastructure develops. So it might be quite difficult politically to get the gas and electricity TSOs to agree to hand over the planning of their infrastructure to an independent operator, even though that is without doubt the most cost-effective way you can actually plan your infrastructure.
How these TSOs work, these transmission system operators, ultimately depends on national governments. And currently, only 5 European countries have given their energy regulators an explicit directive to deliver net zero. And that will shape how fast they can push change through the system. By 2040, so in the next 15 years, Europe plans to jump from getting 20% of its energy from electricity to 50%. That's going to require massive, rapid upgrades. Luckily, there are also ways that grid planners can move more electricity around already.
The most conventional way is just having more power lines. That's really simple in a sense because it's what's normally done.
Really simple, but also really slow. New transmission lines can take 12 to 15 years to plan and build, time that Europe doesn't really have.
But that does involve a huge infrastructure build, which is quite costly and also maybe not the most efficient way to go about it, especially because we're looking at a huge change in the next 15 years.
That's where non-wire-based solutions come in, Elizabeth explains. A bunch of these are just about smarter planning and squeezing more out of the existing electricity system.
So things like putting more batteries on your grids, incentivizing consumers to actually use electricity at different times. So if you go home at 7 p.m., whether you charge your car at 7 p.m. or 2 a.m. makes no difference as long as you can drive off the next morning. And having a system where you get some automated program that will actually choose when is best to charge your car, both for the power grid stability, but also for your bank account.
Take a recent example from Australia. The government there recently announced that it'll offer residents 3 hours of free electricity every afternoon. Thanks to the extensive build-out of solar, energy from the sun is now flooding the system at that time of day and driving down wholesale prices. With this policy, the government is hoping to encourage people to use power when it's most abundant. And then there are also other ways to make the grid we've got now work even harder.
So one very commercially available solution is what they call dynamic line rating, which is when you stick a bunch of sensors along a power line in order to better monitor the temperature fluctuations.
Normally, power operators limit how much electricity can flow through a line to avoid it overheating. But currently, they're doing this blindly, without knowing the exact temperature of the power line at any given time. With sensors, they can see the exact live temperature and potentially push more power through.
You can increase immediately your capacity by 40% in some cases. So you're talking about a huge increase in capacity from just sticking a bunch of temperature sensors along a line.
And there's another solution to grid bottlenecks that often gets overlooked. It's not as easy to picture as a giant spinning turbine or a transmission line, but Marcial says it's just as important.
I mean, the investments should go everywhere on the grid, not only in physical things, but also in building regulations or investing on learning how the electrical grid works with the actual regulations and with future regulations.
Grid operators ultimately work within the boundaries set by regulations. And often, those regulations are designed for an old, outdated system, not a clean, distributed and flexible one. Marcial says that Spain hasn't updated some of its key energy regulations in more than 2 decades.
And if we look at how electrical grids were 20 years ago, the things were much, much more different. So we need also to speed up energy transition that way, and it's something that was very, very clear after the Spanish blackout.
We'll be back after this short break.
I'm Samir Patel, editor-in-chief at Quanta Magazine. Our mission at Quanta is to cover what we call basic or fundamental research in science and math. That means the kind of work that's driven by curiosity and discovery and the search for knowledge. We're interested in how and why everything around us works the way that it does. On our brand new show, the Quanta Podcast, you'll meet the writers and editors behind the magazine, and together we'll explore the biggest ideas and the tiniest details. Join me for the Quanta Podcast, your weekly dispatch from the frontiers of science and math.
From Denmark to California to South Australia, solar and wind power are already proving to be huge contributors to a reliable grid.
When it comes to renewables, we do have some very indisputable evidence about the benefits. So it comes down to whether you want cheap electricity or not, which is something I think almost everyone cares about.
Back in 2019, Spain's electricity was some of the priciest in Europe. But by early 2025, the cost of their electricity was about a third lower than the European average. Now, it's some of the cheapest wholesale electricity in Europe.
And that is solely linked to the expansion of wind and solar across Spain in those years. In fact, if we compare them to other major countries such as Germany, Italy, the UK, Spain was actually the only one that managed to split its power prices from the price of gas, and that's really why it saw this drop in electricity prices over the last 5 and 6 years.
And those prices are expected to continue dropping as more solar and wind come online. And the better the power grid is prepared for more renewables, the sooner those savings will come.
So now there's a choice to be made. If you want to continue with that and drive down power prices and actually reap the benefits, or if you want to revert and go back to depending on gas power prices and their various fluctuations.
Fluctuating gas prices, higher energy bills, lost investment, energy instability, and delayed climate action. Those are the costs of failing to update the grid, experts warn. Engineers like Marcial say this is a complex task, but it's more than possible and pretty urgent.
We have to think nowadays of the electrical grid like a puzzle where all the pieces are different and we need to find a way to connect each other. We need to design regulations to connect each other better. We need to use the technology that we have nowadays to connect all those pieces, because we have to remember that this is also about energy transition. So we need the energy transition to lower our carbon emissions.
So, power generation is one thing, transmission is another. But once those pieces of the puzzle are in place, what is still standing in the way? And what's possible? Next week, in the final part of The Switch, we want to tie some of these threads together in a conversation with Bill McKibben, the environmentalist and writer who's been covering this crisis for 40 years. I'm asking him why the transition keeps stalling, but also why he feels like this moment is different.
Humans have made their way on this planet for 700,000 years by setting things on fire. And now we don't really need to. Now we have to figure out how to make the transition as quickly as possible to powering ourselves largely from the large ball of burning gas that the good Lord was kind enough to hang 93 million miles above our heads.
That's coming up next week in part 3 of this special mini-series. I'm Charlie Shield. This episode was reported, written and produced by me. It was edited and mixed by Neil King. Our studio technician was Simon Berghahn.
It's tough being German. People think I'm punctual, but I'm often late.
Let's do a quick check of stereotypes.
When you think of Germany, you think of
extreme punctuality,
perfect planning,
high-tech and efficiency.
Well, think again.
Welcome to Delayland,
a podcast about a country that needs your help.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.